Hello, I'm Dr. Jean Rioux. I'm going to be teaching a homeschool connections course this fall entitled Introduction to Early Modern Philosophy. One of the things I was looking for in this course was to introduce high school students to the kind of reasoning that followed both obviously the ancient and scholastic periods, medieval periods in philosophy, because there was a radical shift away from a sort of realism in philosophical study to a different way of looking at things. The modern period begins more with the individual as the basis for philosophical reflection and less with the natural world. Early modern philosophy does begin, it is constituted by really a debate between those who emphasize reason as the source of truth and those who emphasize the evidence of the senses as the source of truth. The first group, those who emphasize reason, are called rationalists. The second group are called empiricists, right? So we have a basis placed upon empirical evidence for one's conclusions. We'll be looking at 7 individuals, sort of defining the beginning, middle, and end of the early modern period. Starting off with the acknowledged founder of early modern philosophy, and that is Rene Descartes, the French philosopher in the 17th century. So, of course, Descartes is famous, even to those people who haven't studied a lot of philosophy. He's recognized as the man who began his whole philosophical system with the fact of his own existence. So his famous cogito ergo sum in Latin, or I think, therefore I am. With Rene Descartes, we have a way of looking at philosophy that rejects a common sense starting point. Now, I'm not saying Descartes doesn't make sense, but he doesn't want to begin with assumptions which he cannot be of which he cannot be absolutely sure. So, for instance, Descartes would say, I'm not sure whether things around me actually exist. My senses tell me so, but my senses can be deceived. So he rejects that. He doesn't necessarily say there is nothing outside of his mind, but he says, I cannot be sure that there is. And therefore, the existence of external reality can't be the foundation of my philosophy, he would say. It's very interesting. You read one of his most famous works, the Meditations, and that's the work we'll read. There are 6 meditations, and in the course of them, Descartes tries to make a case that even if we begin with the skeptical assumption that the external world does not exist, nevertheless we can arrive at certain fundamental truths which we know to be so, necessary truths, and we can build a philosophy on that. September 8th, when the course starts, we'll be beginning with this man, Rene Descartes. We'll be spending 2 classes on Descartes, September 8th, and then the following week, the 15th. On those Thursdays, we'll be working our way through the 6 meditations, in which we'll see Descartes trying to prove that he exists, trying to prove the existence of God, and ultimately working his way back around to the existence of the external world. So this initial assumption that I cannot be sure of the existence of the external world, Descartes has a roundabout way of coming back and saying, well, nevertheless, it is real. Okay? So those first 2 classes set the stage for the kind of reasonings you'll find in the early modern period. Okay, so meditations then, the first 2 classes, the first 3 meditations for the first, second 3 meditations for the second. Now, at that point, we'll remain within the rationalist tradition. We'll turn to a Dutch-born philosopher named Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza. He was born in 1632. Spinoza looks at Descartes' method and looks at his achievements and tries to purify them. Descartes' method is very much a rationalistic method. What can reason discern independently of the evidence of sense? Spinoza, I think, believes that Descartes hasn't gone far enough. So he presents us with a system which is rationalistic from beginning to end. So Baruch Spinoza, we'll be spending September 22nd discussing his work. He's a very difficult read. We won't be reading a whole lot of material from Spinoza, but the manner in which he presents his assumptions and conclusions is unusual. For those of you who have done Euclid or who've done mathematics in which you set out definitions and axioms and then demonstrate propositions from them, Spinoza will be familiar. But it's unusual to encounter philosophy presented in this way. Okay? So we'll be talking about Spinoza as developing the logical consequences of Descartes' rationalism. So after Spinoza, we'll turn to a man named Gottfried von Leibniz. He was born in the middle of the 17th century, 1646. So we have a nice chronological progression, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. There's also a progression in thought. I think I like to see Leibniz as reacting to the extreme conclusions Spinoza draws out of Descartes' rationalism, softening that somewhat. So he doesn't come to conclusions that are as difficult to accept, right, with Spinoza. Spinoza, for example, is a very strict determinist. Okay? So Leibniz is a little uncomfortable with these conclusions. He wants to restore some of what was contained in traditional philosophy up to that point, especially among the scholastics. And he makes no bones about this. He does say, you know, the scholastics had some things that were good. Descartes may have been too extreme in rejecting them wholesale. The work we're going to read from Leibniz, we're going to actually look at two different works. The Discourse on Metaphysics, and then in the first class, that is September 29th, and in the second class on the 6th of October, we'll be looking at a work called The Monadology. Leibniz presents some very novel solutions to problems like the problem of freedom. So Leibniz is going to form then sort of the third leg of the rationalist side of the debate. At this point, we'll turn to the empiricist side of things, beginning with the British philosopher John Locke. John Locke, of course, also famous for his political philosophy. He was born the same year as Spinoza, 1632. He died in the turn of the century, around the turn of the century in the 18th century, in 1704. In his case, John Locke wants not to emphasize so much what reason can come up with independently of the evidence of sensations, but more the opposite. What can our sense experience guarantee for us by way of truth? Are there things we can conclude to of necessity? And are there therefore things that we have to reject, we have to set aside as unable to be discovered by the mind? Famously, Locke sets aside a certain class of sense data, sense information. He distinguishes our sensible impressions into those that are primary and those that are secondary. Right? And so he sets one of the groups aside, saying, well, really, they aren't real. There's no such thing as color. Color is, finally, something, an idea we produce in ourselves on the basis of other more fundamental experiences. Okay? So there's something somewhat skeptical about Locke. He's beginning to pare away legitimate experiences and contrasting them with experiences that have no correlate in the external world. We'll be spending two classes then on John Locke, October 13th and October 20th, and of course looking at his fundamental work in epistemology called his essay Concerning Human Understanding. From Locke, we'll turn to another man. We'll be spending two classes on a man named George Berkeley. Now, Berkeley is very interesting. He was an Anglican bishop, familiar with John Locke's writings. Seemingly, he wanted Locke to be more honest to his own principles, right? Like Spinoza with Descartes. More honest to his own principles than Locke himself seems to have done. So he says, well, if you exclude the category sensibles as not being, this category of sensibles as not being real, right, and you accept those, you have to have a good reason for accepting these others. Berkeley saw no good reason to accept them. So all sensation is reduced to thought. There is no real correlate between the mind and external reality. And in fact, Berkeley is famous for denying the existence of an external world. He's what we call an immaterialist. As he sees it, this is a wonderful way to address some of the skeptical conclusions the materialism of the day were coming to. Okay? So, for instance, if all is matter, there is apparently no human soul that is distinct from the body. The soul and the body are both matter, and therefore the soul will be destroyed at the end of life. Similarly, God, by definition being an immaterial reality, doesn't exist. Berkeley sees his materialism as a way of addressing the problems that arise in the materialist philosophers' or among them, of his day. So 2 classes on Berkeley, October 27th, and then the 3rd of November. We'll be reading his treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, in which he lays out his philosophy, argues for it, and shows how it's compatible with his Christianity. In terms of early modern philosophy, the last person we'll consider is a man named David Hume, who, as Descartes defines the beginning of the early modern period, Hume certainly defines the end of it. David Hume was a self-avowed skeptic. He understands his skepticism as being of a certain sort, but his conclusions and the manner in which he arrived at them have probably, among these philosophers, with the possible exception of Descartes, been most profound with respect to their influence for our day. Many people, scientists, the scientific method, look at the world in much the same way as David Hume did, sometimes even without realizing it. So Hume is a very important person to read, understand, and be able to grapple with, right, as one approaches the influences of early modern philosophy in our day. Hume's skepticism, then, will concern us on the 10th of November and the 17th of November. We'll be reading selections from an inquiry concerning human understanding. Okay, that leaves really one class. We'll, of course, not be having class on Thanksgiving Day, but we will have class on the 1st of December. What I want to do there is to show how, on the one hand, rationalism leads to a certain conclusion in Leibniz. So we have Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz on the one hand. Similarly, empiricism leads to a certain conclusion on the other side. We have John Locke, George Berkeley, and then a progression all the way to David Hume. Rationalism seems to lead to a sort of dead end on the one hand over here, and empiricism leads to a different sort of dead end on the other hand here, and we have an impasse. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher. He was born in 1724, so we're getting into the beginnings of the 18th century, and then he died in 1804, right to the beginning of the 19th century. And his intention in dealing with this dispute between the rationalists on the one side and the empiricists on the other is to provide a kind of synthesis. He believes he can come up with a defense of human knowledge that takes into account what he sees as the good aspects or the true aspects of rationalism and the good or true aspects of empiricism. We'll be looking at that resolution on the last day of class, December 1st, and then finally asking, well, with the beginnings of the modern period, so we have early modern, 17th and 18th century, modern philosophy, 18th and 19th, and now 20th century. Okay. Does Kant solve the problem? Does he actually give us a resolution to the difficulties we saw between 17th and 18th century philosophers, or among them? So that, in a nutshell, is what I'm going to be doing in early modern philosophy. I'd welcome any questions any of you have. I'm sure you can send them via the web page for this course on the Homeschooling Connections website. And if you're taking the class, I look forward to having you in class. Look forward to having these discussions. Take care. God bless.